When we left off, Kelechi Obi had finally allowed himself to feel something real again. In the small, unglamorous restaurant of a woman named Chiamaka Eze, even as a war he had told no one about continued to close in around him from every direction. What neither of them yet knew was that the man behind that war had just discovered the one thing Kelechi could no longer afford for the world to see him lose. Chiamaka Eze had known Kelechi Obi for nearly 15 years. They had started in business together as young men with nothing but ambition and borrowed capital, building their first small logistics contract side by side before their paths eventually split. One staying loyal to the company they had built, the other quietly deciding that loyalty was a luxury he could no longer afford once he saw how much larger Kelechi's share of their success had grown. For 2 years, Chiamaka had been buying up shares in Kelechi's company through a web of smaller companies that did not carry his name, patiently assembling the pieces of a takeover that Kelechi's own lawyers had only partially uncovered. He was closer than Kelechi realized, to controlling enough of the company to force him out of the very empire he had built with his own hands. What Chiamaka needed now was leverage, something that would either distract Kelechi at a critical boardroom vote, or, better still, something that could be used to make him look reckless and unstable to the very shareholders whose votes he needed to survive. A woman he had been secretly seeing for months, a chef with no public profile and no protection from the kind of scrutiny wealthy men's rivals could unleash when they wanted to, was exactly the kind of leverage a patient man could use. It started quietly, the way most attacks on ordinary people by powerful men tend to start. A journalist with connections to Chiamaka's camp began asking questions around Chiamaka's restaurant. Questions dressed up as harmless curiosity about a rising chef's love life, but designed to dig up anything that could be twisted into scandal. Suppliers she had worked with for years suddenly found their contracts and payment terms under unusual pressure, phone calls made by people who never identified who they worked for. Chiamaka noticed the strain before she understood its source, waking some mornings to find her restaurant's usual rhythm disrupted in small, almost deniable ways that nonetheless added up to something that felt, unmistakably, like she was being watched. Kelechi noticed too, though it took him longer than it should have to connect the sudden pressure on Chiamaka's business to the war he was fighting in his own boardroom. When he finally understood what was happening, when a trusted contact inside Chiamaka's camp quietly warned him that his old friend had identified Chiamaka as a target, something in Kelechi shifted from exhaustion into a kind of clarity he had not felt in years. He had spent 2 years trying to protect a company, a legacy, a name on a building. He realized, sitting across from Chiamaka one evening as she nervously admitted that something strange had been happening with her suppliers, that there was something in his life now that mattered to him more than any of it. Before we continue, if this story has you holding your breath the way it held mine while putting it together, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss what happens next. The confrontation, when it finally came, did not happen in a courtroom or a boardroom, but in Kelechi's own office, late one evening, when he finally called Chiamaka Eze directly instead of letting his lawyers handle what had become, in his mind, no longer just a business dispute. He told his old friend plainly that he knew exactly what had been happening to Chiamaka's restaurant, and that whatever quiet war Chiamaka wanted to keep fighting over shares and boardroom votes, it needed to stay exactly there, far away from a woman who had never once been part of the business they built together. Chiamaka, for his part, did not bother denying it. He told Kelechi, with the calm confidence of a man who believed he already held every advantage, that a man distracted by love rarely survives a fight for his own company, and that Kelechi would do well to remember which mattered more before the shareholder vote arrived. It would have been easy in that moment for Kelechi to do exactly what Chiamaka expected, to protect his empire by quietly stepping back from Chiamaka until the danger passed, to treat her as a liability to be managed rather than a person to be protected. Instead, he did something that surprised even the people who had known him for years. He went public, not with accusations he could not yet prove, but with a simple statement to the press and to his shareholders that he was in a relationship with Chiamaka Eze, that he was proud of it, and that anyone attempting to use her as a weapon against him would find that it only strengthened his resolve rather than weakening it. He turned the very leverage Chiamaka had been building into something Chiamaka could no longer quietly use, because a threat loses most of its power the moment it is dragged out into the light. The shareholder vote, when it finally arrived weeks later, did not go entirely Kelechi's way, but it did not go entirely Chiamaka's way either. Enough shareholders, unsettled by the aggressive and underhanded tactics that had come to light in the lead-up to the vote, sided with Kelechi to keep him in control of the company he had built, even as Chiamaka managed to retain a smaller, but still significant stake, ensuring their rivalry, though weakened, was far from finished. Kelechi walked out of that boardroom having kept his company, but he understood, more clearly than he ever had before, that keeping it had never been the thing that saved him. Chiamaka Eze never asked Kelechi to choose between his empire and his heart, because in the end, he never truly had to. What she gave him, without ever intending to, was a reason to want to win the fight in the first place. Something his money and his buildings and his logistics contracts had stopped being able to provide long before she ever walked out of that kitchen in her apron to ask him whether the meal had been good. They did not marry quickly, and they did not marry quietly either. What matters here is simpler than any wedding, and perhaps more important than any boardroom victory. A man who had forgotten how to taste anything walked into a small restaurant on an ordinary Tuesday evening, found himself in the middle of a war he never asked for, and came out the other side having finally learned the difference between what he had built and what he actually wanted to protect.